Have you ever noticed that some people walk into a room without saying much, without trying to stand out, yet the atmosphere around them shifts instantly? Eyes are drawn to them almost unconsciously. Not because they are trying to impress, but because there is something about them that others cannot ignore. A feeling that is difficult to name, yet undeniably real. Carl Jung pointed out that human beings are not drawn to what is displayed on the surface, but to what is sensed at a deeper level of the unconscious. It is there that attraction stops being a skill and becomes a state of presence. It does not come from trying to be liked, but from a person who has stopped chasing validation. You may have once believed that to become attractive, you needed to speak better, do more, prove more. But the paradox is this: the more you try to conquer, the more you lose your natural magnetism. And the more you return to your true self, the more effortlessly attraction begins to emerge. In this video, we will walk together through 10 profound psychological principles of Carl Jung, not to make you better, but to make you irresistible, in a way that others cannot control or replicate. And pay close attention to rule number 10, because it is not what makes you impressive, but what determines whether your presence is deep enough that others cannot look away, even when you are not trying to do anything at all. Rule 1. Do not explain yourself. A person who does not need to explain is not cold. It is simply that they no longer place their value in other people's judgments. There is a moment that feels very familiar, so familiar that many people do not even recognize it as a problem. It is the moment right after you have finished a sentence, or chosen to remain silent, when almost immediately, a small but very clear urge rises inside you. Maybe I should say a bit more. Not because something important was left unsaid, but because you are afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being seen as unpleasant, afraid of being labeled as distant, afraid of being left out. And so you explain. One sentence, then another, then one more reason. Just to be safe, even though, in reality, no one asked you to do so. That sense of unease is not loud. It does not explode into intense anxiety. It is just a thin wave that slips in right after every pause. A silence that lasts slightly longer than usual, and you begin to feel suffocated, not because something is wrong, but because silence means you no longer control how others are seeing you. You do not hear feedback. You do not know how you are being interpreted. And that ambiguity is what makes you uncomfortable. So you speak again, as a way of protecting yourself, of adjusting the image of yourself in other people's eyes. Many people grow up with the belief that if they do not explain themselves, they will be misunderstood. If they do not speak up, they will be forgotten. If they do not clarify, they will be excluded. That belief runs so deep that every moment of silence no longer feels peaceful, but feels like losing something essential: acceptance. You slowly become accustomed to constantly adjusting yourself, adjusting your words, adjusting your attitude, adjusting even your emotions, just to keep relationships smooth, calm, and free of friction. Carl Jung once wrote, "The ego is only the center of our field of consciousness, but it is not the center of our personality." When the ego is still fragile, it easily confuses inner worth with external reactions. You begin to believe that if others misunderstand you, then your value must also be distorted. To prevent that, the ego rushes in. It explains. It justifies. It tries to clarify everything, not because truth needs defending, but because self-image needs protecting. In this case, explanation is no longer communication. It becomes a defensive reflex. Notice something very subtle. You do not explain yourself much when you are around people who make you feel safe. You explain the most when you are in spaces where you are unsure whether you are accepted. There, every silence feels like a test, and you do not want to fail. So you speak, you clarify, you add details, you actively fill the gaps, just to make sure you are still okay. This shows up clearly in very ordinary situations. You reply to a message late, and before the other person even asks, you add, "I've been busy and couldn't check my phone." Sometimes, the other person did not even notice, but you cannot tolerate the idea that you might be seen as indifferent, or in a meeting, you have already contributed enough. But when there is nothing left to say, You still force yourself to add a few more comments, just to prove that you are still present. Not because the content is necessary, but because you are afraid that if you stay silent too long, you will become invisible. These behaviors are not wrong. They are deeply human. The problem is this: the more you explain, the more you send an unconscious message that your existence needs approval. And others, even without intending to, can feel it, not logically, but energetically. Someone who constantly explains carries an unsteady presence. They speak a lot, but leave little weight behind. They try to clarify, but unintentionally dilute their own presence. Carl Jung also emphasized that an immature ego is always seeking validation from the outside to compensate for inner insecurity. When you explain too much, what you are really doing is not communicating, but asking for reassurance. You want to hear, even in silence, that someone understands you. Yet paradoxically, the more you do this, the more you lose your ability to stand firmly in your own experience. Try to recall someone you have found truly grounded. Perhaps they did not speak much. Perhaps they did not explain every action. Yet you did not doubt them. You did not need proof. Their silence did not create discomfort. It created stability. Not because they were cold, but because they did not place their value in being understood correctly or not. They understood themselves, and that was enough. So the real question is not, should I explain or not, but rather, why do you feel compelled to explain? Are you speaking because it is truly necessary, or because you cannot tolerate silence? Are you clarifying reality, or protecting an image of yourself from a judgment that has not even been made? The moment you become honest with this question, you begin to see the true motive behind your words. The way to become more attractively self-possessed does not lie in suddenly becoming silent or trying to appear mysterious. That is just another form of defense. The real solution is to pause. The moment you feel the urge to explain, pause for one beat. Do nothing. Simply observe what is happening inside you. Where does that restlessness come from? What fear is it pointing to? And if you do not explain, what is the worst that could actually happen? Most of the time, the answer is very small, far smaller than the fear you are carrying. When you stop explaining, something strange begins to happen. You do not become distant. Instead, others begin to move closer. Because when you are no longer rushing to clarify, no longer scrambling to correct how others see you, you step out of an invisible game. The game where you must constantly prove that you are okay, right, easy to understand. The moment you step away, a space appears, and it is that space that draws others in. The person who does not explain forces the other to interpret. They begin to guess, to wonder, to adjust their behavior to match your rhythm. Not because you are manipulating, but because you are no longer handing them the authority to define you. Whoever speaks less controls the tempo. Whoever does not rush to prove themselves holds the emotional lead. And this control of rhythm is the core of magnetism. Carl Jung wrote, "The less we understand ourselves, the more we project onto others. When you do not explain, you become a reflective surface. Others begin to see in you what they are seeking: stability, depth, or simply an anchor they cannot dominate. And human beings are always drawn to what they cannot fully grasp. Attraction does not come from being fully understood. It comes from not needing to be fully understood. When you stop justifying your existence, you do not disappear. You become more defined. Fewer words, but each presence carries weight. No explanations, yet others pay attention. And that is the moment you move beyond self-respect into something deeper, becoming someone whose silence alone makes others lean in. Not because you are trying to attract, but because you no longer need to. Rule 2. Do not try to conquer. Fatigue does not appear after rejection, but right in the moment when you are trying to be liked. There is a kind of exhaustion that is difficult to name. It does not come after a breakup, nor after a blunt rejection. It arrives much earlier. It appears right in the process of you doing everything right. You speak more tactfully than usual, smile more than feels natural, pay attention to every small reaction from the other person. You are not doing anything wrong. You are simply trying. And yet, strangely, the more you try, the emptier you feel. as if every moment of attention comes at the cost of your own energy. If you look closely, you will notice that you are constantly scanning. A fleeting glance is enough to make you adjust your next sentence. A brief silence makes you rush to fill it. You speak not because you truly want to speak, but because you are afraid of losing the connection. And the more you hold on to connection this way, the more fragile it feels. Because deep down, you know that what the other person is responding to is not fully you, but a version of you that is being performed. Disappointment arrives quietly, not as a sharp letdown, but as a vague sense of emptiness. You have done everything right, yet the response is not what you hoped for. Or worse, you do receive a response, but it does not satisfy you, because somewhere inside, you understand that if you stop trying, that attention might disappear. And so you keep trying, keep adjusting, keep conquering, caught in a loop with no exit. Carl Jung once wrote, "Projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. When you long to be loved but are not yet grounded enough to give that love to yourself, you begin projecting that need onto others. You see them as a source of validation, as proof that you are worthy. And instead of meeting them as an equal human being, you live to please the image you believe they expect. The encounter stops being a connection and turns into an effort to win acceptance. Here lies a very subtle misunderstanding. You think you are moving closer, but in reality, you are moving away from yourself. Every time you adjust to fit the taste, you trade away a small part of your essence. At first, it is so minor you barely notice, but over time, that misalignment accumulates. You no longer know whether you are speaking because you want to, or because you want to be kept, and your energy begins to change. It is no longer presence. It becomes a quiet plea to stay. This shows clearly in everyday situations. You change the way you speak, just to hold someone's attention. You bring up topics you do not truly care about, laugh at jokes you do not find funny, agree with viewpoints you do not fully believe in, not because you are fake, but because you are afraid that if you are yourself, the attention will disappear. Or you become overly proactive, texting first, checking in constantly, always being the one who keeps the conversation from falling into silence. At first, the other person feels comfortable. Over time, you feel drained, not because they are taking from you, but because you are giving from a place of lack. And this is the crucial point related directly to attraction. When you try to conquer, you unknowingly place yourself lower in the emotional rhythm. You are the one chasing, adjusting, fearing loss. The other person, even without intending to, senses this. Not through thought, but through feeling. Someone who needs to conquer is always predictable, and what is predictable cannot create desire. Carl Jung emphasized that an ego that has not been consolidated seeks union from the outside. The paradox is this: the more you seek, the more magnetism you lose. Because attraction is not born from the effort to be loved, but from a state of not needing to be loved in order to stand firmly. When you live to conquer, you are telling the world, "I need you to feel enough." And the world, being very honest, responds by withholding emotional power from you. Notice how it feels to encounter someone who does not try to conquer. You are not overwhelmed by excessive attention. You are not pulled into a hurried rhythm. Instead, you feel a strange space. A presence that does not demand, does not push, does not require immediate response. And that space is what makes you begin to adjust yourself. You become the one who texts first. You become the one who checks in. You become the one who wants to understand. Not because they are playing psychological games, but because they are not placing their emotional burden on you. The essential question now is this: are you seeking connection, or are you asking for it? Connection comes from the meeting of two complete people. Asking comes from one who lacks, and one who is assigned the role of filling that lack. Only one of these states creates attraction, and it is not the second. The solution to this rule is not becoming cold or pretending not to care. That is simply another form of defense. The solution lies in stopping the pursuit of acceptance. When you stop living to be chosen, you give yourself back the right to set the rhythm. You no longer adjust every small reaction. You no longer ask yourself, "Am I interesting enough?" You begin living according to your true nature, saying what you genuinely think, staying silent when there is nothing to say, and allowing natural distance to do its work. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you allow yourself to be who you are, not a version optimized to be liked, you become unpredictable in a deeply compelling way. Others can no longer read your strategy, because you have none. You are not trying to advance, retreat, or hold on. You are simply there, whole. And that very state makes others wonder, what allows this person to stand so firmly without trying? This is where attraction appears, not because you become perfect, but because you are no longer dependent, not because you are skilled at conquering, but because you no longer need to conquer. When you stop pursuing acceptance, you create a new magnetic field, the field of someone who does not need to be chosen to feel worthy. And people, whether they admit it or not, are always drawn to what they cannot control, to what requires them to step forward rather than be invited. That is where this rule leads you, not to make you feel merely okay, but to make you someone others want to approach, not because you try, but because you no longer need to. Rule 3. Mastering presence. You have probably been in a conversation that felt perfectly normal. You spoke enough, smiled at the right moments, nodded politely, yet, when you left, no one truly remembered that you had been present in the room. This is a very familiar experience, so familiar that many people assume it is simply normal. You did nothing wrong. You were not rude. You were not unusually quiet. Everything was fine, and yet, that very sense of fine leaves behind a nameless emptiness. You walk away from the encounter, and even though nothing negative happened, you still feel as if you just passed through, leaving no trace, creating no echo, giving no one a reason to turn back. If you are longing to become irresistible, this is a crucial sign, because attraction does not come from saying the right things or behaving correctly, but from whether others feel that you were truly there. Most people lose their magnetism not because they lack communication skills, but because they are present through behavior, not through energy. Being present through behavior means your body is there, but your mind is elsewhere. You hear, but you are not truly listening. You nod, but your gaze does not anchor. You respond, but your words pass through the air without weight. Your attention is fragmented. Part of you monitors the other person's reactions. Part of you plans what to say next. Part of you worries about how you are being judged. The result is that no part of you fully stays with the moment. When your mind is elsewhere while your body is here, your energy becomes thin. The other person may not be able to name the feeling, but they sense it clearly. You are not anchored in the space, and without an anchor, there is no pull. You can talk for hours and still leave no imprint. Carl Jung wrote, "Where attention goes, energy flows." When your attention is fragmented, so is your energy. If the inside is not unified, the outside cannot be sharp. A faint presence is not the result of lacking value, but of failing to gather yourself into the moment. And attraction, ultimately, is the ability to concentrate energy into a point strong enough that others feel drawn toward it. Notice how it feels to meet someone who is truly present. They do not need to speak much. They may even be very quiet, but when they look at you, you feel seen. When they listen, you do not need to repeat yourself. When they are there, time seems to slow down, not because they are doing anything special, but because their entire being is exactly where it needs to be. By contrast, when your presence is partial, others are not pulled toward you. They remain polite, they respond, but there is no urge to go deeper. No curiosity. No desire for further contact. No feeling of, I want to be near this person longer. And if you are seeking attraction, this is a significant loss. This plays out constantly in everyday life. You listen to someone tell a story, but your mind is already preparing a response. When they finish, you reply quickly and smoothly, yet you miss the emotional core of what they shared. They nod, but their gaze drifts away. Or you speak at length, logically and thoroughly, yet afterward no one brings up the conversation again. Not because the content was poor, but because the energy was not dense enough to linger. Carl Jung believed that when the inner world is fragmented, a person loses the ability to generate a field of presence. When part of you is in the past, part in the future, and only a small fraction in the present, you cannot create a magnetic field. And without a magnetic field, there is no attraction. Others are not drawn to you because there is nothing pulling them in. The essential question here is this: are you truly here? Not whether you are physically present, but whether you are living in this moment. When you speak, can you feel your own breath? When you listen, do you notice the rhythm of the other person? When you are silent, is that silence deep, or is it the silence of not knowing what to say next? If you long to become irresistible, mastering presence is not a social skill. It is an inner choice. You choose to gather yourself, to be here, to stop scattering, to stop living inside other people's minds. And that choice alone creates a powerful shift in magnetism. The solution to this rule does not lie in speaking better, performing better, or becoming more interesting. It lies in returning to bodily sensation. It sounds simple, but this is where real attraction begins. When you feel your breath, you anchor energy into your body. When you hold a steady gaze, you create connection, without intrusion. When you become aware of how you stand, sit, lean, and pause, you begin to shape the rhythm of the space without saying a word. Carl Jung emphasized that the body is where the unconscious expresses itself most clearly. When you live inside your body, you do not need to try to attract. Others naturally feel that presence as a quiet pull. They do not know why, but they want to stay. They want to speak more. They want to come closer, not because you are outwardly impressive, but because you are truly there. Observe how others respond when you are fully present. They slow down. They listen more deeply. They adjust their rhythm to match yours. This is not manipulation. It is the natural effect of a magnetic field. A person with strong presence does not need to dominate. The space organizes itself around them. If you are listening to this and feel a slight discomfort, ask yourself, in your recent conversations, were you truly there? Or were you caught in the anxiety of having to impress? Were you listening, or merely waiting for your turn to speak? The truth is that full presence is the deepest boundary of self-respect. When you are there with your whole being, you do not need to prove anything. You do not need to conquer. You do not need to hold on. And that is precisely what makes you irresistible, because no one can control someone who is truly here. They can only feel them and respond. At this level, your attraction no longer lies in words or actions, but in state. The state of someone who is not fragmented, not chasing, not passing through. Someone whose presence is so complete that even their silence carries weight. And when you leave the room, others may not remember what you said, but they remember one thing very clearly. There was something about you that made them want to stay longer. That is where this rule leads you, to become someone whose mere presence is enough to create desire. No effort, no performance. Just being there. Fully. Rule 4. Mastering emotional synchrony. Carl Jung emphasized that meaningful encounters do not happen by sheer will, but at the precise moment when the inner world and external circumstances touch each other. At first glance, this idea may sound abstract, but if you are longing to become irresistible, this is one of the most important keys you can grasp. Many people do not fail because they lack attractiveness, but because they move out of rhythm, not the wrong intention, not the wrong emotion, the wrong timing. And in the realm of attraction, timing matters more than words, gestures, or appearance. Some people enter too early. They ask when emotions are not yet open. They move closer while the other person is still guarded. They reveal themselves when the space has not yet become safe. The result is that the other person does not feel reached, but invaded. On the other end of the spectrum are those who always arrive too late. They wait until the moment has cooled. They remain silent when they should have stepped forward. And that hesitation creates distance, not depth. If you look closely, you will notice that neither type lacks goodwill. What they lack is the ability to sense another person's emotional rhythm. And when rhythm does not align, attraction cannot form. Because attraction is not about what you do, but about when you do it. Carl Jung referred to this state as synchronicity. He wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." Synchrony is not coincidence, but the capacity to recognize the moment when inner and outer realities move in the same rhythm, when your emotions do not force, rush ahead, or pull, but listen and blend into the energetic field that is unfolding. If you are striving to become irresistible, this is where attraction shifts from likable to uncontrollable. They cause others to step into their rhythm naturally. Think back to moments when you felt drawn into someone, not because they talked too much, not because they were overly proactive, but because they appeared at exactly the right moment. They asked a question when you were ready to answer. They stayed silent when you needed to be heard. They moved closer when your body had already opened, not when you were still closed off. You did not feel led. You felt accompanied. Now, recall moments when your interest faded quickly, usually not because the other person lacked appeal, but because they accelerated the process. They wanted closeness, before closeness existed. Clarity before emotions had taken shape. Confirmation, while the space was still testing itself. And that very rush destroyed attraction. At the unconscious level, this is quite clear. When you arrive too early, the other person's nervous system has not had time to adjust. Pressure is felt, even if no one applies it directly. When you arrive too late, the energy has already shifted, the emotional window has closed, and you are left standing in front of a shut door. Carl Jung once said, "Everything depends on how one meets the problem." In this context, the problem is not the other person, but the moment itself. The same action, placed at the wrong time, becomes a mistake. Placed at the right time, it becomes magnetic. In everyday life, this unfolds in very subtle ways. You can sense when to ask and when to remain silent, not through logic, but through feeling. When the other person's gaze begins to linger longer, when their breathing slows, when their responses open rather than close. These are small signals, but if you ignore them, you will act according to a preset plan instead of the living rhythm of the moment. And acting according to a preset plan is exactly what drains attraction. Plans are never as flexible as lived perception. An irresistible person does not live by script, they live by rhythm. They let the moment lead, rather than forcing the moment to obey them. Ask yourself honestly, are you listening to rhythm, or are you pushing the process forward? When you speak, are you speaking because emotion has ripened, or because you feel impatient? When you move closer, is it because the space is inviting you, or because you fear missing your chance? When you fall silent, is it a deliberate silence, or a silence born from uncertainty? The difference lies here. A person who masters rhythm never appears rushed, but they are not passively delayed either. They stand in the right place, at the right time. And this creates a powerful effect. Others begin to adjust their rhythm to yours, not because you force them, but because you create emotional safety. The practical solution of this rule is not learning more communication techniques, but observing emotional signals. Before asking, feel. Before moving closer, notice whether the space has opened. Before saying something important, sense the state the other person is in. This requires you to slow down internally, even if outwardly, nothing seems to change. Carl Jung believed that synchrony occurs when a person does not resist the psychological flow. When you stop trying to control outcomes and focus instead on the quality of the moment, you enter a very different mode of presence. And this mode of presence creates an irresistible pull because it makes others feel that meeting you happens at exactly the right time. An irresistible person is not someone who is always available. They are someone who appears at the right moment, not too early to create pressure, not too late to miss the opening. And when they arrive, everything feels strangely fitting. No explanation needed, no confirmation required, only felt. If you are listening to this and feel slightly unsettled, that is a good sign, because mastering rhythm cannot be learned through theory alone. It demands a return to your own subtle capacity to feel, a capacity many people have lost by living too much inside their heads. At its deepest level, respecting rhythm means respecting emotional boundaries, not only the boundaries of others, but your own as well. When you stop forcing yourself to move faster than your emotions, you become grounded, and that groundedness radiates outward as a powerful signal. I don't need to rush, because I trust my rhythm. And that is precisely what makes you irresistible, because no one can manipulate the rhythm of someone who lives in alignment with it. They can only feel it and be drawn in. Rule 5. Using absence consciously. What makes people remember is not constant presence, but the trace that remains after you leave. This sentence touches a truth that very few people dare to face directly. Most of us lose our attractiveness, not because we care too little, but because we are there too much. There when we are not invited. There to fill every gap. There to reassure ourselves that the connection still exists, and that constant presence, which seems like closeness, quietly numbs the emotions of the other person. If you long to become irresistible, this rule forces you to reverse a very familiar reflex. The reflex to hold on, so you won't lose. Because attraction does not grow in fullness, but in meaningful space. Not in how many times you appear, but in what remains when you leave. Observe closely. Well-timed absence always leaves an echo. A conversation that ends while it is still engaging. A meeting that concludes just as emotion reaches its peak. A message left unanswered for a moment even though you could reply immediately. These moments do not allow the other person to close the experience. Instead, they carry it with them. By contrast, constant presence, even with the best intentions, quickly makes everything familiar, predictable, and eventually dull. Emotionally, the person who is always there often believes they are giving, but at a deeper level, they are draining the other person's imaginative space. When everything is said, assured, and filled in, the unconscious has no reason to keep searching, and where there is no search, there is no desire. Carl Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." The unconscious does not respond to completeness, but to what remains unfinished. It is the not yet complete, the not yet clear, the not yet fully touched, that activates the inner current of seeking. When you withdraw at the right moment, you do not take connection away. You return the power of imagination to the other person's unconscious. This may sound paradoxical, but recall what has lingered with you the longest. Rarely are they relationships that felt overly complete. More often, they are moments cut short, a sentence not fully spoken, a glance left unfinished, a meeting that ended sooner than you wished. It is precisely these gaps that keep memory alive. In everyday life, this rule shows itself clearly, ending a conversation at its most engaging point, withdrawing when emotional intensity has just formed, instead of staying until it dissolves on its own, not because you want to play games, but because you understand that a peak needs to remain intact, not fully consumed. Most people are afraid to do this. They fear that if they leave without reassurance, they will be forgotten. They fear that if they are not present long enough, the connection will break. But the truth is the opposite. The person who does not dare to leave is the easiest to replace, because they leave no space for memory to work. Ask yourself honestly, do you dare to leave without needing reassurance? Without a promise? Without confirmation? Without knowing for sure that the other person will remember you? Or do you only leave once you are certain you are still being held in their mind? The answer to this question reveals whether you are living from self-worth or from fear of losing connection. From the perspective of attraction, conscious absence creates a powerful effect. When you withdraw at the right time, the other person begins to complete the experience on their own. They recall your voice. They replay moments that have passed. They wonder what might have happened if the conversation had continued. And it is this process that makes you uncontrollable in their mind. This is not manipulation if your motive does not come from lack. Withdrawal in this rule is not punishment, not playing hard to get, not disappearing to create insecurity. It is an action that arises from inner fullness. You leave because you trust that the trace you left behind is deep enough to function on its own. Carl Jung also said, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." When you are absent consciously, you neither fight emotion nor chase it. You allow emotion to continue moving within the other person's inner space. And this is what transforms you from a concrete individual into a living experience. If you pay attention, those with the strongest magnetism are rarely always present. They appear, create a very clear energetic field, and then withdraw, unhurried, without asking to stay, without explaining. And when they are gone, something lingers in the air, an absence that is difficult to name. The practical solution of this rule is not learning how to disappear, but recognizing when to withdraw, when emotion has just ripened, when the conversation has just touched something real, when the connection is deep enough to sustain itself. At that moment, leave before familiarity erodes the experience. Let memory do the rest of the work. You will notice a very clear shift when you apply this. Others begin to seek you out, not because you were there too much, but because you are no longer there. They initiate reconnection because something inside them remains unfilled, and that space carries your shape. The person who is not afraid of absence is someone with deep inner roots. They do not need to cling in order to exist. They do not need reassurance to feel at ease. They know their value does not lie in how often they appear, but in the quality of the trace they leave behind. And it is this groundedness that creates a powerful attraction, because it makes others feel this truth. You do not need them, yet they need the feeling you bring. When you use absence as a language, you no longer speak through words, but through resonance. You no longer appear to be seen, but to be remembered. And at the deepest level of attraction, being remembered is always stronger than being seen. If you have made it this far, perhaps a few moments just now touched something very real in your own experience. Thank you for staying and listening all the way to this point. If this content made you reflect on how you show up, withdraw, or leave traces in others' hearts, share it not to convince anyone, but to preserve for yourself a necessary, slower rhythm. Now, we will move together into rule number 6, where contact is no longer an impulsive act, but becomes a doorway leading deeper into a form of attraction that others cannot ignore. Rule 6. Turning contact into a doorway. The same touch can sometimes leave a lingering echo, and other times pass as if it never happened. The difference does not lie in the skin, but in the inner state of the one who touches. If you long to become irresistible, this rule asks you to re-examine a behavior that seems small, yet acts as a direct doorway into another person's unconscious. Contact. Not touching more or less. Not touching boldly or cautiously, but touching from where? From lack or from presence? From the desire to take or from inner fullness? Most forms of touch in daily life happen unconsciously. A perfunctory pat on the shoulder, a habitual handhold, a light touch used to fill an awkward silence when words fail. These contacts are quick and convenient, but empty. They carry no information, leave no aftertaste, open nothing within the other person. And so, they pass as though they never existed. By contrast, conscious touch is entirely different. It does not arise from a need to soothe oneself, but from full presence with the moment. When you touch from that state, your body becomes a language. And the other person, even if they cannot name it, feels it very clearly. Carl Jung wrote, "The body is often the personification of the shadow of the ego. The body carries contents the conscious ego cannot control." When you touch someone, what is transmitted is not just the warmth of skin, but the entire psychological state residing within you at that moment. Urgency, impatience, the desire for a response, or steadiness, slowness, and self-possession, all of it travels through the touch. That is why the same action can produce entirely different effects. A hand on the shoulder at the right moment can open a feeling of being seen and acknowledged. But that same touch, if delivered while you are anxious or seeking reassurance, can cause the other person to withdraw unconsciously, not because they dislike you, but because their body has sensed a subtle intrusion. Observe your own impulse closely. When you want to touch, what is happening inside you? A pull to draw closer, a desire for validation, a fear of losing connection, or a very calm state, where you feel complete even without touching. This answer determines your magnetism, not any particular technique of contact. In everyday life, Those with strong magnetism rarely touch often. But when they do, the timing and quality of their contact stay with others for a long time. A pause before reaching out. A gaze held for half a beat longer. A hand on the shoulder after emotional attunement has already occurred. That slowness turns contact into a doorway, rather than a mere gesture. Carl Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. True contact always creates change. But that change only happens when two inner states meet without coercion. When you touch from desire, you seek a reaction to fill yourself. When you touch from presence, you allow a reaction or not, without needing control." Do you recognize this difference? When you touch someone to take a feeling, the touch ends quickly. When you touch someone to open, the feeling continues to live after your hand has withdrawn. And it is precisely this continued life that makes you irresistible. Think of the moments you remember for a very long time. They are rarely the most explicit contacts, but the ones that occurred in silence. A very light touch, at the right moment, a wordless closeness. A presence deep enough to need no further action. The unconscious stores these moments as imprints, because they are not immediately consumed. At a deeper level, Jungian magnetism lives here. When you touch from self-mastery, the other person does not feel led, yet feels drawn in. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because you carried no need to dominate. And where there is no need to dominate, space opens for the other person's desire to arise. Ask yourself honestly, do you touch from longing or from presence? Do you use contact to move faster or to go deeper? Do you need immediate feedback? Or are you steady enough to let emotion unfold within the other person? This question is not meant to make you cautious, but to help you recognize the true power of conscious contact. The solution to this rule is simple, but not easy. Touch less, but touch when emotion is ready. Ready here does not mean when you want to, but when your inner rhythm has slowed enough to no longer need an outcome. When you touch from that state, contact ceases to be an action and becomes an invitation. The other person may step into it or not, and that freedom is what creates magnetism. When you apply this rule, you will notice something very clearly. Others begin to respond more strongly to very small touches. They remember the contact. They revisit the moment. They wonder why such a simple gesture left such an aftertaste. And in that wondering, you have become an experience, rather than someone trying to impress. Clear boundaries are what give contact its depth. When you do not touch to fill a gap, that gap becomes space for the other person's unconscious to operate. And where the unconscious begins to move, attraction is no longer within the control of reason. You do not need to touch more to be desired. You need to touch more precisely. Touch when you need nothing from the other person. Touch when you are present enough to offer a complete moment and then withdraw your hand without loss. When you can do this, contact no longer becomes an endpoint, but a doorway opening into a movement that continues long afterward. And it is here that you begin to touch a form of magnetism that is very difficult to resist. Others remember you, not only for the sensation, but because they became a different version of themselves in the moment they were touched. Rule 7. Do not repeat the pattern. Everything still seems fine. Conversations continue steadily. Messages arrive on time. Meetings follow their familiar schedule. There is no conflict, no rupture, nothing wrong that needs fixing. And yet, somehow, the early excitement has disappeared. No one remembers exactly when it left, only that something has quietly cooled, even while the outer form remains intact. If you long to become irresistible, this is one of the hardest rules to accept, and also one of the most powerful, in creating attraction. Do not allow yourself to become a predictable pattern. Not because you need to play mysterious games, but because the human unconscious is not drawn to repetition, even when that repetition feels safe, kind, and harmless. On the surface, repetition creates stability, but at a deeper level, repetition numbs emotion. When others know in advance how you will react, how you will care, what energy you will bring, their brain stops paying attention. Not because they no longer like you, but because there is nothing left to discover. And where there is no discovery, attraction, quietly, withdraws. Carl Jung once wrote, "Life really does begin at 40. Up until then, you are just doing research. Life and the life energy within human beings does not operate in a straight line. It needs movement, transformation, new layers of experience to keep flowing. When you repeat yourself for too long, psychological energy begins to stagnate. And when energy stagnates, vibration slowly dies. Look carefully at relationships in your life that were once vibrant. Most of them did not end with a dramatic event. They faded because of familiarity. Familiar to the point where every gesture could be anticipated. Familiar to the point where your presence no longer created disturbance. You were still there, but you no longer created waves. The behavioral mechanics here are very subtle. You are not doing anything wrong. You care the way you have always cared. You react according to your character. You behave consistently, reliably, understandably. But that very understandability, when there is no inner movement, becomes what causes others to stop being curious. And when curiosity disappears, desire follows. Carl Jung said, "No tree," it is said, "can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Vitality does not come from repeating the safe zone, but from allowing oneself to transform. Not transforming to become someone else, but to allow inner energy to keep circulating. When you dare to shift your vibration, you force others to look again, to adjust, to sense you anew. In daily life, repetition often appears in very familiar forms. The same way of checking in, the same style of caring, the same reaction whenever the other person is sad, happy, or silent. At first, this creates safety. Over time, it erodes feeling. The other person no longer waits for your response, because they already know it. Have you ever noticed the moment you begin a sentence, and the other person already knows how it will end? Or when you have not yet reacted, and they already know what you will do next? That is when the pattern has formed. And once the pattern forms, attraction begins to weaken, even if affection remains. What matters here is this. Desire does not arise from absolute familiarity. Desire arises from movement, from the sense that the person in front of you still has layers not yet fully revealed, that their presence still carries the potential to surprise, even slightly. Carl Jung emphasized, the creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct. The living part of a human being does not come from thinking about how to act differently, but from allowing energy to play, to shift, to avoid being boxed in. When you live too long in a fixed role, that energy becomes locked. And others, at an unconscious level, sense this very clearly. Observe people with enduring magnetism. They do not change their essence, but they do not repeat old vibrations. Some days, they are quiet. Some days, sharp. Some days, they withdraw. Some days, they are intensely present, not to manipulate, but because they allow themselves to live honestly with their inner state. That lack of fixation makes it impossible for others to reduce them to a single image. Are you unintentionally boxing yourself in? Are you holding on to an overly stable image because you fear confusing others? Are you repeating old ways of caring because you believe, that's who I am, even when something inside you has already shifted? These questions are not meant to make you change for others, but to return movement to yourself. The solution to this rule is not becoming erratic or artificially unpredictable. The solution is this. Change the vibration, not the essence. You are still you. But how you enter a space, the rhythm you bring, the degree to which you open or hold back all of this, can move with your lived inner state, rather than old habits. Changing vibration can be very subtle. Sometimes it is silence, instead of immediate reaction. Sometimes it is leaving earlier than usual. Sometimes it is not explaining, not adding, not fulfilling the role. These small shifts force the other person's unconscious to recalibrate how they perceive you. And where recalibration occurs, attention returns. Ask yourself, are others still curious about you? Do they still want to explore you? Or are they simply with a familiar, predictable version that no longer creates disturbance? The answer to this question is not for self-blame, but to help you see where you stand on the axis of vitality. When you stop repeating the pattern, something very interesting happens. Others begin to lose their sense of control. They are no longer certain how you will respond. They must pay closer attention, listen more carefully, sense more subtly, and it is precisely in this state that desire is activated, not because you did something special, but because you are no longer predictable. Carl Jung said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking." When you repeat patterns merely to preserve stability, you unconsciously hand over the power to define the relationship. When you allow your vibration to move, you reclaim your vitality, and attraction appears not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence. Vitality is the sign of a self in motion. When your self is in motion, others cannot remain unmoved before you. They are either drawn in, or they step away. But in both cases, you are no longer a bland presence. You become a living experience. And that is precisely what makes you irresistible. Not because you are more perfect, but because you refuse to let yourself harden into a familiar pattern. You live, you move, and where there is real movement, there is always desire. Rule 8. Awaken primal instinct. Carl Jung once believed that human beings are not truly moved by reason. Reason only helps people agree. What makes them resonate, feel drawn back, even become haunted, are ancient images and instincts sleeping deep within the unconscious. You can say the right thing, say something eloquent, say something logical, and still leave no trace at all. But a gaze held at the right rhythm, a pause just long enough, a shift in breathing, can make someone remember you for a long time without knowing why. If you long to become irresistible, this rule marks a pivotal transition. From here on, attraction no longer resides in words, arguments, or efforts to impress. It lives in the body, in pre-verbal signals that the other person's unconscious reads, long before the intellect has time to intervene. To understand this, we must begin with a simple but difficult truth. Most of us live too much in our heads. We choose our words carefully, control our expressions, adjust our behavior to be appropriate. But that very over-control suffocates what creates natural magnetism, vital instinct. When the body is forced to constantly obey the intellect, energy becomes flat. And where energy is flat, there is no attraction. Pay attention to 3 very small elements that carry immense weight in any deep interaction. Breathing, eye contact, posture. These are not communication techniques. They are primal language. Rapid or slow breathing reveals the level of inner safety. Averted or steady eye contact shows whether you are present or defensive. A closed or open posture reveals whether you are contracting or living from fullness. The other person may not be able to name these things, but their unconscious perceives them with absolute clarity. Carl Jung wrote, "The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual." When you enter a space with a body that is truly present, you activate very ancient layers of memory in others. Not personal memory, but collective memory, where human beings once relied on gaze, breath, and movement to sense who was safe, who was trustworthy, who was worth approaching. At this level, attraction is no longer about what you say, but about who you are in that moment. Someone who speaks very little but holds a gaze 1 beat longer can create more resonance than someone who talks for hours. A voice that is low, slow, unhurried often causes others to unconsciously adjust their breathing to match. And when breathing synchronizes, a sense of connection appears without explanation. Have you ever been near someone who made you naturally slow down your speech? Sit up straighter, listen more closely, or remain silent longer without discomfort? It was not because they did something special. It was because their body was in a regulated state, and that state transmitted itself to you. This is primal magnetism, something reason cannot manufacture. Now think of moments when you tried to impress. You spoke more than usual, moved more, smiled more, but inside, there was tension, shallow breathing, eyes that did not linger. a body leaning slightly forward, as if seeking response. Others may have been polite, may have responded, but they were not held, because their unconscious received a very clear message. You needed them more than they needed you. Carl Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When you are possessed by the idea that you must be attractive, must be liked, must create connection, your body loses freedom. And when the body loses freedom, instinct is suppressed. Others may not know what you are thinking, but they feel the strain, unmistakably. Awakening primal instinct does not mean acting crude or unrestrained. On the contrary, it is refinement. It is the ability to inhabit your body fully, not rushing ahead with words, not overpowering with action, simply being present enough for the body to speak on its own. A very ordinary example. In a conversation, instead of responding immediately when the other person finishes speaking, you pause for half a second, just half a second. You look at them for one more beat. You take a deeper breath before answering. That pause, if you do not rush to fill it, creates a strange pull. The other person becomes more attentive. They do not know what you are thinking, and that not knowing activates curiosity. Or in a moment of contact, a touch on the shoulder. A handshake if you do not touch immediately, but allow a very brief pause beforehand. The other person's body prepares. And when the contact happens, it leaves an after effect, not because you touched firmly, but because you touched when both of you were already in the same rhythm. Are you speaking from reason or from instinct? Are you letting your body lead, or are you forcing it to follow a script in your head? This question is not meant to make you analyze more, but to help you feel. Because instinct is not activated by thought, but by attention returning inward. The solution to this rule is simple, but not easy. Slow down, not to appear calm, but to sense where your body actually is. Before speaking, notice your breath. Before looking away, check whether your gaze is avoiding or connecting. Before stepping forward, feel your posture. Are you moving from fullness or from lack? When you live one beat slower than your inner impulse, something very interesting happens. You reclaim the ability to lead not others, but your own energy. And when energy is led, others begin to adjust to you. This is where attraction becomes irresistible. Others feel you before they have time to think about you. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." When you turn inward to your body, to your inner rhythm, you awaken something very ancient in yourself and in others. That part does not care whether you are right or wrong. It asks only one question. Near this person, do I feel alive? When you live in alignment with healthy instinct, you touch the shared depth of humanity. There is no need to try to be attractive, no need to perform. You become an energetic field that others want to be near, want to return to, want to understand more deeply. This is a form of attraction that cannot be memorized or copied. It can only be lived. At this point, you no longer need to ask, what should I say to be more attractive? The real question is, how fully am I inhabiting my body? Because when your body is truly there, instinct speaks. And when instinct speaks, others do not need a reason to be drawn in. Rule 9. Become an experience that cannot be copied. People forget words very quickly, but they do not forget the feeling of having once become a different version of themselves when they were near you. There is a quiet but brutal truth. Most of us can be replaced. Words can be repeated. Style can be learned. Behavior can be imitated. But there is one thing that cannot be copied: the experience another person has when they are near you. If you long to become irresistible, this rule is where all previous efforts crystallize. From here on, you no longer try to make an impression. You become an imprint. You may have met someone like this before, not the most eloquent person in the room, not the most noticeable presence at the party. Yet after they leave, a strange feeling lingers. As if something inside you has been touched. You cannot clearly identify which sentence, which moment, or which action it was. You only know that when you think of them, you think of a feeling. And that feeling does not repeat itself with anyone else. To understand this, we must begin with how human beings remember. We tend to believe we remember through rational memory, facts, words, events. But in reality, what decides is something deeper: sensory memory and emotional imprint. You do not remember every sentence they spoke, but you remember the rhythm of their voice. You do not remember exactly what they did, but you remember how you felt when you were with them. And that feeling, if strong enough, becomes a reference point for future experiences. Carl Jung wrote, "The unconscious does not think in words or images, but in symbols." The unconscious does not store data. It stores symbols. A gaze held a moment longer, a silence not immediately filled, a timely withdrawal. These very small things, when repeated with consistency, become your personal language. And that language, if felt deeply enough, cannot be copied. So what is the problem for most of us? We try to become special by adding more, saying more, doing more, showing more. But the more we add, the more diluted the experience becomes. Others may remember you as someone who is a lot, but they rarely remember you as someone who lingers. True attraction, on the other hand, comes from the ability to subtract and still leave an after effect. Look closely at two behaviors that seem passive but are extremely powerful: how you remain silent and how you withdraw. Silence does not mean saying nothing. It is the choice not to speak when you absolutely could, and that choice creates power. Withdrawal does not mean disappearing. It means leaving when energy is rising, when connection has just reached its threshold, leaving behind just enough space for the other person's unconscious to keep working. Have you ever been in a conversation where the other person ended it sooner than you expected? Not because they were cold, but because they did not try to prolong it. That moment, if you notice carefully, activates a very primal reflex. You want more, not more information, but more feeling. And that controlled absence sharpens the experience. Carl Jung warned, what you resist persists. When you try to hold on, to secure, to make everything feel complete, you unintentionally extinguish the unconscious's ability to operate on its own. But when you allow a little incompleteness to exist, the experience continues to live without your presence. And that is when you become irreplaceable as a feeling. Ask yourself honestly, what do people remember you for? Because you say many good things? Or because when they are near you, they become different, calmer, more alive, more willing to be themselves? A person becomes irresistible not because they are the best, but because they allow others to touch a different version of themselves. And once someone has touched that version, they will always look for a way back. This does not come from constant change. It comes from consistency with your own energy. Not style, not image, but rhythm of living, rhythm of presence. The way you enter and exit another person's space. When that energy is clear enough, others do not need to compare. They simply know that near you, something feels right. A very ordinary example. Two people are both polite, both caring, both good listeners. One always responds immediately, is always there, always available. The other does not. They are fully present when they are there, but they do not linger, do not explain, do not cling. After a few meetings, the first becomes familiar, the second becomes anticipated. Not because they are playing a game, but because they do not distribute their energy indiscriminately. Carl Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. When you live in alignment with your own rhythm, without trying to adjust to resemble anyone else, without creating a version designed to be liked, you begin to create an experience that cannot be copied. Others may find someone more skilled, more attractive, more interesting, but they will struggle to find again the feeling they had when they were near you, if that feeling came from authenticity." The solution to this rule does not lie in learning more skills. It lies in removing inner contradiction. When your words go one way, but your inner energy goes another, the experience fractures. When you are present one way today and another way tomorrow, others cannot retain you in memory. But when you are consistent in silence, in withdrawal, in the way you enter and leave, another person's unconscious begins to recognize you as a symbol. You do not need to be unique. You do not need to stand out. You only need to be real. Real enough that others cannot blend you with any other experience in their memory. And then, attraction is no longer something you create. It is something that happens. At this point, the question is no longer, how do I make others remember me? The more accurate question is, who do others become when they are near me? If the answer is, they become a more alive version of themselves, then you have touched the core of Jungian attraction, and that experience, once imprinted, cannot be copied. Rule 10. Deep desire, elegant self-mastery. Tension does not come from desire itself. It comes from a very subtle moment when you suddenly realize that you are rushing more than necessary. Not rushing because circumstances force you to, but rushing because something inside pulls you to have it now, achieve it now, touch it now. And that precise moment, if you observe closely enough, is when attraction begins to leak. Desire in itself is not bad. On the contrary, without desire, there would be no fire. The problem lies in how you relate to your desire. Some people repress it until it dries out. Others indulge it until it burns everything down. Both lose their magnetism, just in different ways. The repressed become cold and lifeless. The indulgent become rushed, predictable, easy to read, easy to control. In both cases, attraction disappears. Carl Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct." Desire is that raw, primal energy. But for it to become attraction, it must be refined, not eliminated, and not exaggerated. Refinement here is not a moral concept. It is a process of transformation. Look at people who are truly irresistible. You will rarely see them pounce. Their eyes have fire, but not haste. Their movements have force, but not pressure. They do not pretend to be indifferent, yet they do not let desire drive their behavior. This balance creates a powerful paradox. Others can feel their desire, but cannot control it. And human beings are always drawn to what has fire yet remains out of their grasp. If you examine this more deeply, you will notice something important. The moment you chase desire, your rhythm falls into the other person's hands. You begin reacting to external signals. An unanswered message makes you restless. A lukewarm glance makes you accelerate. A stretch of silence pushes you to fill the gap automatically. At that point, desire is no longer something you lead. It is something that is triggered and drags you along. And when you are being dragged, attraction vanishes. By contrast, when you can hold desire within yourself without letting it spill into action, you keep the rhythm. You do not extinguish the fire, but you also do not pour gasoline on it. You allow desire to exist as a steady source of heat, enough to warm the space, but not enough to burn it down. The other person can feel that warmth. They know you want, but they also know you do not need. And that is where magnetic tension is born. Carl Jung described this process as a form of psychological alchemy, where raw energy is transformed into conscious power. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Desire that is unconscious will control you. Desire that is conscious will serve you. And when desire serves you, it becomes an aura, not a chain." Ask yourself honestly, in the moments when you felt least attractive, what was really happening? Most of the time, it was not because you were not good enough, but because you were rushing. Rushing to get a response, rushing to be validated, rushing to secure the connection. And this haste is always perceived by the other person's unconscious. Even if you never say a word, it weakens attraction the way a star loses gravity when it sheds mass. The solution to this final rule does not lie in suppression. It lies in leadership, leading your own rhythm. When you feel desire rising, you do not need to crush it. You simply do not let it decide your next move. Take one breath. Hold your gaze for a moment longer. Pause before taking the next step. These very small acts create the difference between someone who is carried away and someone who generates pull. Are you running after desire, or are you leading it? This question, if answered honestly, will tell you exactly where you stand on the axis of attraction. A person who leads desire does not need to prove anything. They do not need to possess. They do not need to rush. And because of that, they become someone others want to move toward, rather than someone who has to chase. After moving through all 10 rules, you may notice something important. Not a single rule asks you to become someone else. Not a single rule teaches manipulation or performance. All of them return to one shared point, coming back to your whole self, where you are deeply present, strongly desirous, yet self-directed enough not to lose your rhythm. True attraction is not something you add to yourself. It is something that is released when you stop leaking energy into haste, fear, and the need to be chosen. When you stand firmly in your desire without being dragged by it, you do not just become attractive, you become irresistible. And that is not because you do more, but because you are more. Before you leave, I want to ask you one thing. Among the 10 rules you just went through, which moment made you realize where you once lost your own attraction? Leave a comment to share your reflection or experience, not to be right or wrong, but to see that many others are also learning how to lead their energy, just like you. And perhaps your story will touch someone who needs to hear it right now. We often think that attraction is something we have to learn, practice, and display outwardly. But at the end of this journey, perhaps you have felt something different. True attraction is not created. It is released when you stop betraying yourself. When you stop rushing, stop asking for permission, stop explaining, stop clinging, and begin to be present in alignment with the deepest rhythm inside you. Carl Jung wrote, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." Perhaps what makes you irresistible does not lie in doing more, but in having the courage to let go of old layers that no longer belong to you. Not to withdraw from the world, but to step into it with a different weight. And if something inside you resonated while listening to these reflections, that is not a coincidence. It is intuition speaking. If you want to continue this journey of going deeper into Jungian psychology, presence, and inner attraction, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will meet again at deeper levels.